There's a story the history books do not tell in full. It is not the story of American air power dominating the skies over Europe. That version you have already heard. It is celebrated in museums, carved into monuments, and recounted with unflinching pride. It is, to a significant degree, true. What is also true, and what has been quietly, almost deliberately, left out of the popular narrative, is that American bomber pilots, at the peak of their desperation, refused to fly unless British radar teams were with them. Not as a preference, not as a suggestion from high command, as a condition. That is where this story begins. Not with triumph, with silence, with the kind of silence that settles over a briefing room when the mission briefing officer pins up the losses from the day before, and 50 men stare at the board, doing the mathematics of their own survival in their heads. The year is 1943. The 8th Air Force, the United States Army Air Force's primary strategic bombing arm operating out of England, is conducting daylight precision bombing raids deep into Nazi-occupied Europe. The strategy is bold, almost reckless in its ambition. American military doctrine, refined through the interwar years at the Air Corps Tactical School at Maxwell Field, Alabama, held firmly to one central belief, that a well-trained bomber crew, flying in tight formation, armed with the Norden bomb sight, the most sophisticated optical bombing instrument in the world, could deliver destruction with surgical precision upon any industrial target in broad daylight. This was not merely a tactical preference. It was an ideology. The Norden bomb sight was America's secret weapon, so classified that bombardiers were required to swear a personal oath to destroy the device before allowing it to fall into enemy hands. Military officials boasted it could drop a bomb into a pickle barrel from 20,000 feet. Magazine articles called it the instrument that would end the war. Politicians cited it as proof of American technological supremacy. Air crews were trained on it for months before ever seeing combat. It was, in the minds of the men who flew the B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators over Germany, the difference between war and slaughter. What they did not yet understand, what the air war over Europe would teach them, painfully, at a cost measured in young men, was that the Norden bomb sight was only as good as the conditions that allowed a human eye to see. And over Europe, the human eye was often useless. The cloud cover over Germany in autumn and winter was not merely an inconvenience. It was a tactical catastrophe. Missions that had been planned with mathematical precision at bases in Cambridgeshire and Suffolk would be rendered meaningless the moment the formation reached the European coast. The cloud layer, dense, unbroken, thousands of feet thick, sat like a gray wall between the bombers and their targets. Bombardiers pressed their eyes to their Norden sights and saw nothing but white. Formations that had flown 6 hours into hostile airspace, losing men to Luftwaffe fighters and German flak the entire way, arrived over their targets and dropped their bombs blindly, often miles from the industrial facilities they had been sent to destroy. It was not a failure of skill. It was not a failure of courage. These men had both in extraordinary measure. It was a failure of doctrine, the collision between a theoretical framework developed in peacetime and the brutal, unpredictable physical realities of actual warfare. But that failure was not yet fully apparent in the early months of 1942, when the 8th Air Force first began its campaign from English soil. Those early missions were small, probing attacks against targets in France and the Low Countries, within range of RAF Fighter Command's Spitfire escort. Losses were manageable. The strategy appeared to be working. The Americans arrived in England convinced, even a little arrogant, that they had solved the central problem of strategic bombing. The RAF, they observed with polite but unmistakable condescension, had abandoned daylight operations entirely after catastrophic losses in 1939 and 1940. The British now flew at night, concealed by darkness, relying on a growing suite of electronic navigation systems to find their targets. American officers viewed this as a compromise, an admission of defeat, a retreat from the standard of precision that air power demanded if it was to be taken seriously as a war-winning weapon. The British, for their part, said nothing too pointed. They had already learned what the Americans were about to learn. They had paid for that education in full, over 4 years of war. They would wait. The RAF senior officers, men like Air Marshal Sir Arthur Harris, had not abandoned daylight precision bombing out of timidity. They had abandoned it because they had sent their own squadrons against Germany in daylight in 1939, watched them be torn apart by Messerschmitt fighters, and understood, with devastating clarity, that the mathematics of bomber survival in unescorted daylight raids over a defended enemy nation simply did not work. The British solution, night bombing supported by electronic navigation, was not a retreat. It was an evolution, born of hard experience and accelerated by extraordinary scientific innovation. That innovation had a name. It had, in fact, several names. G. Oboe. H2S. The cavity magnetron. The chain home network. These were not just pieces of equipment. They were the products of one of the most concentrated periods of scientific development in the history of warfare. A British achievement in radar technology that would, within 2 years, quietly become the foundation upon which the entire American strategic bombing campaign was rebuilt. The Americans, arriving in England with their Norden bomb sites and their daylight doctrine, did not yet know they would need it. By late 1943, they would know. They would know completely. And some of them would know it in the most devastating way possible. Sitting in debriefing rooms, counting the empty seats where their crewmates had been sitting that morning. The reckoning was coming. In August of 1943, the 8th Air Force received its first serious warning that the strategy was breaking. On the 17th of that month, 376 bombers were dispatched in a massive double strike against the Messerschmitt aircraft plant at Regensburg and the ball bearing factories at Schweinfurt, deep in the heart of the Reich. The attack on Schweinfurt was intended to cripple Germany's production of ball bearings, the small, precisely engineered steel components found in virtually every piece of German military machinery, from tank turrets to aircraft engines. Without ball bearings, the Wehrmacht could not fight. At least, that was the theory. The mission was a catastrophe. 60 American bombers were shot down. 600 men were killed, wounded, captured, or listed as missing in the space of a single afternoon. 20% of the attacking force did not return to England. Among those who did return, aircraft were riddled with cannon fire, hydraulics shot out, engines feathered, fuel tanks dry. Ground crews who worked through the night to repair the plane spoke in subdued tones. The numbers were not the kind you discussed loudly. American commanders absorbed the losses and pressed forward. The theory was sound, they argued. The ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt had been significantly damaged. The Germans were reeling. A follow-up raid would finish the job. The follow-up raid came on the 14th of October, 1943. It would enter the historical record under a name that required no elaboration among those who lived through it. Black Thursday. 291 B-17 flying fortresses took off from bases across England and flew into Germany. 60 of them never came back. Another 17 were so severely damaged, they were written off. Over 650 airmen were killed, captured, or reported missing. 22% of all bomber crew who flew that day. It was the single worst day in the history of the United States Army Air Forces up to that point. In the arithmetic of loss that governed the lives of every man who flew from England, the numbers were shattering. A bombardier named Frank Murphy, flying his first major depenetration mission that day, later recalled in his diary, "From the time we crossed the enemy coast until we left it again, we were under continuous attack. The sky was full of burning aircraft towers. I kept thinking that I needed to see the target, that I needed to see something through the bomb site. All I could see was fire and smoke and the shapes of other planes falling." The Norden bomb site was irrelevant on Black Thursday. You cannot hit a target with an optical instrument when you are being torn apart by fighters. Black Thursday was not an isolated event. It was the violent peak of what historians now call Black Week, a stretch of raids in mid-October 1943, during which the 8th Air Force lost 148 heavy bombers in 7 days. Nearly 13% of all attacking aircraft. Approximately 1,500 men. By the end of the month, the mathematics of survival had become so brutally clear that morale among combat crews was in genuine crisis. In 1943, only 25% of American heavy bomber crews completed their mandatory tour of 25 missions. The other 75% were killed, severely wounded, or taken prisoner. To put that in human terms, If you walked into a briefing room of 100 men in the summer of 1943 and looked around at your crewmates, the statistical probability was that 75 of those faces would not be present at a similar briefing 12 months later. The 8th Air Force halted all depenetration raids into Germany for over 4 months following Black Thursday. The strategy of unescorted daylight precision bombing had, at that moment, effectively failed. It was in this silence, this enforced pause, this confrontation with failure, that American commanders began, seriously, to look at what the British had been doing for 4 years. The British, since the beginning of the war, had been engaged in one of the most remarkable programs of scientific warfare in history. It had begun with a single, urgent problem. How does a small island nation, outnumbered and outgunned, defend itself against the most powerful air force in the world? The answer, developed in the mid-1930s under the scientific leadership of a Scottish physicist named Robert Watson Watt, was radar. What Watson Watt and his team built, initially along the eastern and southern coastlines of England, in a network of tall steel towers called Chain Home, was not merely a warning system. It was a revolution in the way warfare was conceptualized. Chain Home could detect aircraft approaching from a European coast at ranges of up to 200 miles, feeding information in real time to RAF fighter command operations rooms, where controllers could direct interceptor squadrons with the precision and economy of force that was, to German Luftwaffe commanders in 1940, utterly baffling. During the Battle of Britain in the summer of 1940, when the Luftwaffe outnumbered fighter command 3-1 and was flying up to 1,500 sorties a day, the Chain Home network meant that every German bomber formation was being tracked from the moment it formed up over France. RAF controllers knew the size of each raid, its altitude, its bearing, its probable target. They could position their squadrons not to chase the enemy, but to intercept it, arriving where the bombers would be, not where they had been. Against an enemy that could see you coming, the numerical advantage meant far less. This was not the same as American radar in 1940. The Americans, having received preliminary warnings of the Chain Home system's existence, had not yet built anything equivalent. Their radar technology lagged significantly behind Britain's in both range and operational integration. The gap was not one of intelligence or effort, it was one of urgency. Britain had faced the immediate existential reality of aerial attack for years. America had not. That would change in September of 1940. And when it changed because of one suitcase, one train ride to Washington, and one group of British scientists who carried in their briefcases the most important military secrets in the world. In September of 1940, as the Battle of Britain raged in the skies over southern England and the survival of the country itself was in genuine doubt, a small delegation of British scientists boarded a ship bound for North America. They carried with them, inside a reinforced black deed box, the most closely guarded scientific secrets of the war. The mission had been conceived by a British scientist and government advisor named Sir Henry Tizard, a man whose contribution to the Allied victory would remain, for decades, almost entirely absent from popular histories of Second World War. Tizard understood something that many of his colleagues in Whitehall were reluctant to accept. Britain, fighting alone, could not develop and deploy its advanced scientific discoveries fast enough to win. America had the industrial capacity, the manufacturing infrastructure, and the research institutions. Britain had the inventions. The two nations needed each other, and the only way to forge that partnership, Tizard argued, was to give America everything, not as a transaction, not as a trade, but as an act of strategic faith. What the Tizard mission brought to America in September 1940 was staggering in its scope. Blueprints for jet engine technology, early designs for a viable atomic weapon, details on rocket propulsion, formulas for plastic explosives, and at the center of it all, the crown jewel, a small metallic device the size of a large coin, which its British inventors called the cavity magnetron. The cavity magnetron was the most important scientific instrument of the Second World War. It was a vacuum tube capable of generating microwave-frequency electromagnetic pulses of extraordinary power in an extraordinarily compact form. In plain terms, it was the device that made modern radar possible. Before the cavity magnetron, Radar systems like Chain-Home used long radio wavelengths, effective for detecting large formations of aircraft at range, but too imprecise for the fine-grained targeting and navigation work that the air war now demanded. The cavity magnetron allowed radar signals to be compressed to centimeter wavelengths. A radar system built on this technology could distinguish individual buildings, coastlines, rivers, and railway yards from the air. At night, through cloud, through fog, in conditions where the human eye saw only darkness. When the Americans at MIT's radiation laboratory first examined the cavity magnetron, they recognized immediately what they were looking at. One American physicist described it as the most valuable piece of military technology ever brought to our shores. Within weeks, a crash program was initiated. Within months, American factories were producing cavity magnetrons in the thousands. But possessing the technology and knowing how to use it operationally were two different things. The British had years of hard-won experience integrating radar systems into actual combat operations. They had developed not just the equipment, but the doctrine, the procedures, the training, the organizational structures for fighting in electronic war. The RAF had, by 1942, 3 primary radar navigation systems in operational use aboard its bombers. Each was different. Each solved a different part of the problem. GE was a ground-based hyperbolic navigation system, a network of transmitters across England that sent precisely timed radio pulses to a receiver aboard the aircraft. By measuring the time differences between signals from different transmitters, a trained navigator could determine his aircraft's position to within a few miles. GE could not direct bombs to a target on its own, but it solved the first, most fundamental problem of the bombing campaign: finding the target area in the dark and through cloud cover. 4 RAF bombers flying deep into Germany. GE was the compass that replaced the stars when the stars could not be seen. Oboe was more precise, a system that guided a single aircraft along a curving beam transmitted from ground stations in England, with a second beam crossing the first exactly over the designated target. When the 2 beams intersected, the bomb release signal was automatic. Oboe was extraordinarily accurate for its time, capable of placing bombs within a few hundred yards of the target under any weather conditions. It was too precise and too limited in range for general use. Only a handful of specially equipped RAF Pathfinder aircraft could use it simultaneously. But in the hands of those Pathfinders, it could mark a target in the center of Germany with incendiary flares so accurately that the main force following behind had a visible aiming point even in total darkness. H-2S was perhaps the most revolutionary of all 3. Unlike GE or Oboe, H-2S required no ground stations, no transmitters in England, no physical infrastructure. It was a self-contained, airborne ground-scanning radar, a rotating antenna mounted beneath the aircraft's fuselage that continuously swept the terrain below, generating a moving radar map on a cathode ray display screen in the navigator's position. Cities appeared as bright patches of light. Built-up urban areas reflected radar signal strongly, while open countryside reflected weakly. Rivers, coastlines, docks, railway junctions, all identifiable, all visible, regardless of weather or darkness. H-2S gave a bomber crew the ability to see the ground when their eyes could not. When American engineers adapted H-2S for use in American aircraft, producing the H-2X, designated and /APS-15, they gave the 8th Air Force a weapon it had never had: the ability to bomb in clouds, at night, in winter, through conditions that had previously grounded entire missions or rendered them strategically useless. The 482nd Bombardment Group, activated at Station 102, Alconbury, England, in August of 1943, just weeks after the first Schweinfurt disaster, became the United States Army Air Force's first dedicated radar-equipped Pathfinder unit, built explicitly on the British model. British radar operators, navigators, and scientific advisors worked alongside American crews at Alconbury and at other stations across England. This was not a formal secondment of troops. Much of it was informal, practical, urgent. An RAF navigator with 3 years' experience on H-2S, equipped Lancasters, sitting in a Nissen hut at an American base, talking through the display characteristics of radar returns over the Rhine Valley with a young American navigator who had never seen combat. A British scientist explaining to American bombardiers why the Norden bomb sight, for all its mechanical brilliance, could not substitute for centimetric radar when the cloud base sat at 2,000 feet over Dusseldorf. American pilots listened. They had no choice. They had already paid the price of not listening. By the end of 1943, the demand for radar-equipped lead aircraft, Pathfinder crews,